Don't mind when folks are rejoining, if you can just turn your video back on so I know we're ready to get started. We'll maybe give everyone another couple of minutes. This next talk, so Nick DesLauriers is going to talk about decolonizing global health. So I will go ahead and pass off to him.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Nick. I'm R2. And yes, pick for the next 50 minutes or so is decolonizing global health. My interest in this topic, I'm interested in a career in global health, is from some past time living and working in Kenya. In advance here. So some disclosures which I think are important with this topic. I just want to call out that I am a white male American physician from the global north who is talking about decolonizing global health. So acknowledging that I lack representation of the global south, and that I think that that is a very important aspect to this topic. And should also just say now that global north and global south are terms that I often use. I think they're still, I prefer them to developed countries, which I think that dichotomy of terms carries some negative connotations and also some inaccurate connotations. But even global north and global south also have some over generalizability, but it's just the terms that I often use. And just a quick thank you to Doctors Jason Bestie and Steve Gloyd for a lot of the content, which I borrowed. Steve Gloyd is in the Department of Family Medicine and Jason Bestie is infectious disease. All right, so we're gonna start it off by feeling out the audience a little bit. I'm just curious to hear who has heard of the phrase or movement to decolonize global health. And in particular, not just maybe understand or agree with that phrase, but sort of heard it used in the context of global health. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
All
So
right.
Nick, can you see that, Nick? It's about half and half.
Yeah, about half and half, 52% yes. Okay, perfect. All right, so another poll. Who feels that the field of global health needs decolonizing? All right, so it looks like 62% very much so, 38% maybe in some ways or in part, and no one answered no. All right, that's helpful for the rest of the talk. All right, so a little bit of an overview of the talk. This is a talk that is not clinical, but is focused on issues of equity and power in global health. So specifically about the manner and the context that we collaborate with our partners in global medicine and global public health. So I think that this is an important topic because I think our field of internal medicine is an important one in global health. I think the big C word, COVID, certainly is self-explanatory and falls squarely into our field. Infectious diseases, increasing cardiovascular disease and cancer burden. And I think our field is also one that values and has a lot of leaders in health systems and global health. So I just want to say too, while individual diseases or individual public health topics I think are important, I think how we collaborate with our partners is just as important in addressing disparities and in structural injustice. And finally, UW and Seattle are big hubs in global health. The movement to decolonize, quote unquote, global health is very much a topic of conversation within the Department of Global Health here at UW and also within our local NGOs of like the Gates Foundation, PATH, et cetera. All right, so some specific objectives. Number one, how exactly is global health colonized? And I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about a historical and policy lens. Number two, what is the decolonized global health movement and what can we do to help decolonize global health? And number three, limitations of this decolonized framework. And four, briefly, can global health survive its own decolonization? All right, so I just want to open it up and sort of hear maybe half or so, actually 60% said that yes, we definitely need to decolonize global health in some way. So I'm just curious to hear from the group in what specific ways people uh, maybe think that global health in some way is colonial or neo-colonial. I'll just open it up either to the chat or you can definitely feel free to speak too.
I think global health often labors under this assumption of proliferation of Western ideas to non-Western countries, and it seems like a one-way transaction of like our practice, and it doesn't seem as collaborative, and you know that sort of infiltrative like approach is implicit in a colonial perspective.
Awesome, Nisha, thank you. So I'm hearing like a theme of sort of a unidirectionality of values and the way that we choose to do health extended to our global partners. Let's see, I think I just saw something. Yeah, placing our values on other groups from Kim, totally. Any other thoughts? Okay, so I'll show just, this is just a list that I made. Some of the issues that oh, looks like we got one more. I think that there can be a savior mentality as well. Yeah, thanks, Cameron. So yeah, so I think volunteerism, I think a lot of us have heard of this. Short-term trips that people may take that sometimes can be damaging to local health systems when people are just there for a very short time. And the partnering is maybe not long-term or sustainable. And there can be a lot of different perception issues with between local people and the folks who are coming from somewhere else. And then this thing that Cam mentioned with the white savior hero complex, some people that may well be a part of the reason that they're involved, and maybe not necessarily that the work that they're doing is wrong or bad because of that, but I think we do really need to ask ourselves what role our field and as individuals we're having within that context of the hero white savior complex. International NGOs are often criticized for bypassing local governments or community oversight. Global health departments have pretty limited diversity, both diversity, I think, representatives of our, like within the US, but also limited folks who are from other countries that are contributing to the leadership in those departments. Global health academic departments are mostly situated in the global north, although I have seen a lot of exciting new global health departments in countries in the global south, including South Africa, Kenya, India. So it certainly is becoming much more of a global field. And then journals and journal authorship of work that is produced in the global south being first authored by predominantly still Western authors. And the journals that we're submitting to still located in our like USA and Europe, Western Europe, essentially. And then sometimes there's political conditionality of our medical aid or global health funding, whether it's sort of more covert, like political relationships being something that determines where our partnerships are, or more obvious, someone trying to pull a string for a particular action that another country needs to do in order to get that funding. And then finally, I think part of what Anisha was hitting on was who is setting the global health agenda. And the World Bank and IMF, and I'll talk about them a little bit more, are huge players in who determines where funding goes for global health. And the World Bank and IMF are very, very much so historically and currently led by folks from USA or from Western Europe. Traditionally, the World Bank has always had an American president, and the IMF has always had a European president. It's not written anywhere that that's the way it goes, but if you scroll through the folks who have been presidents for either of those organizations, it is almost universal. So I think a lot of these aspects kind of hit on who is benefiting. Is it the global north? Is it the global south? The people that theoretically we say in our field that we're trying to benefit. Okay. So what I'd like to do is spend a fair amount of time talking about global health policy evolution. I'm going to focus on a couple areas in particular, but briefly I want to point out that global health very much does have its roots in colonial healthcare. Colonizing nations first interacting in matters of health with the nations that they had colonized by producing separate healthcare systems for colonists and for indigenous people within those countries or colonies. More in the later, or in, excuse me, the earlier part of the 20th century, a lot of these same colonizing nations were doing a lot of vertical programming, which is, as opposed to horizontal programming, which is more focused on health infrastructure. That's what horizontal programming is. Vertical is programming that's focused on a specific disease, like a lot of the infectious disease eradication programs in the early part of the 20th century. But I'd like to talk a lot more about the birth of the primary healthcare movement in the 1950s through the 70s, and how that's contextualized within the setting of countries becoming newly independent, with a disillusionment with our vertical programming and with a greater focus on horizontal healthcare infrastructure and social determinants of health. And then a transition a little bit away from primary healthcare movement into neoliberalism and market fundamentalism, which continues to really have a massive impact on global health today. All right, so the primary healthcare movement, this again was in the setting of a lot of countries becoming newly independent, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in other parts of the global south. And in the setting of a lot of these countries being left without much of a formal healthcare system when colonizing nations left. This movement was very much a reaction to some of the early vertical eradication programs not having great results. I think we do think about a couple like smallpox that were successful, but there were actually quite a bit of programs that were really unsuccessful, including some early initiatives to eradicate malaria in the 50s and 60s. So policymakers, both internationally and in these countries that were newly independent, realized that we needed robust healthcare systems, horizontal programs. And this is the context that this movement, the primary healthcare movement, was born globally. So these are some of the countries which were touted as having really great early primary healthcare systems. India, and in particular a state called Kerala in India, China, Sri Lanka, Taiwan, South Korea. And some of the aspects that were sort of touted about these systems that seemed to be unifying them was providing health services for everyone, even if those health services were simple, having a way that reached everyone. And then also you'll see the rest of this list involves much more like social determinants of health, integrating into the concept of healthcare, primary education, housing, sanitation, food and agriculture subsidies, and land reform. And so this is a model of primary healthcare, what it looked like in a lot of these countries. It's again like a generalized model, it's not everywhere. But I think if people have maybe spent some time in some of the nations which decolonized in the 50s through 70s, this may look a little bit familiar. If you look at the very bottom where it says health post, that's sort of the most like local community level. We often have CHWs or community health workers, TBAs, traditional birth attendants, which are affiliated with those very local health posts or clinical or health centers, which they're often called. So a very, very local place, including in the most rural places in these countries. And then sort of if someone needs to get referred up, they go on to the district hospital, provincial hospital, national hospital, et cetera. And then on the right side is more of like the parallel administrative and public health system that goes along with that. Oh, thanks, Asib. Yeah, so Asib said Kerala has a socialist government and in turn a strong central health system and did a great job managing COVID because of it. All right. So all of these early successes in newly independent nations culminated in something called the Alma Atta conference in 1978. And this is an absolutely huge conference in global health and in primary health care. 3,000 representatives from 134 countries got achieving all by the year 2000. So really committed to achieving universal health care, with the mechanism of that universal health care being building primary health care infrastructure and focusing also on incorporating the social determinants of health into primary health care. This is a declaration that came out of this conference, kind of paraphrased, but I just wanted to highlight the second item here, that health was considered and agreed upon as a fundamental human right and shared worldwide goal, and that governments were given and agreed as the ones who have responsibility to provide at least basic access to healthcare for their citizens. I also think the bottom one is really interesting, redirecting resources from military to, I can't quite read it because I think it says to social, like things like health. I just found that pretty progressive and forward thinking. All right, so why did primary healthcare not take off? Clearly, we don't have universal healthcare around the world. We still spend at least a bit of money on our militaries around the world. And it's very complex, but a lot of it has to do with the timing, especially of what was happening around the world in the 1980s with a debt crisis and a global recession, and sort of a paradigm shift into economic and political thinking into neoliberalism. And I'll talk about structural adjustment programs and how it relates to that a little bit. But I just want to pause there, just talked a lot about primary healthcare. Any questions or comments, points of discussion that folks have about that topic? All right. So let's talk about the 1980s debt crisis. So the origin of low middle income country debt is pretty complex, but a lot of the factors that are its origin relate to outside forces rather than internal forces. So as a lot of these new countries were becoming independent, they took out loans from the United States and from Western Europe in order to build infrastructure, to inject into their economy. But of course, they had a very limited tax base to be able to pay back their loans within the first few decades. And then the 1970s came along, and there were oil shocks in the United States and then around the world. And these oil shocks essentially are massively rising oil prices for a variety of reasons, including some like politically led embargoes by the OPEC nations. These oil shocks contributed to rising prices in the United States and really bad inflation. So in the 1970s, inflation was a huge, huge problem in the United States. And so the Federal Reserve responded to inflation by increasing interest rates in an attempt to stave off inflation, with the thought being that an increased interest rate is going to decrease overborrowing and overspending. And actually, that's something that is relevant now because it's something that we're talking about doing as inflation is 6 or 7% right now. But this also included foreign loans with an increase in interest rates to nearly 20%. And so as you can imagine, with that high of an interest rate, there was much more an increase in low middle income country debt. And then similarly with the high domestic interest rates, with oil shocks, inflation, this triggered a recession in the United States and around the world. There was lower demand for low and middle income country exports. and exponentially more LMIC debt. And I just want to highlight here too that there's sort of a misconception that all of this debt is related to corruption and poor governance in these countries. But it really is a product of a lot of outside forces, including a lot that's going on in the United States. So this slide just highlights how much this debt is. If you look on the y-axis, that's percentage of gross national product. The x-axis is sort of progressive years into the 80s and 90s. And you can see that in some areas like sub-Saharan Africa, the debt approaches almost 100% of the GNP, more than 100% of the GNP. Sub-Saharan Africa in particular is pretty heavily burdened with this debt. So a lot, again, just to emphasize how much money this is, since the 1980s, $15 billion on average annually has flowed from African nations to US banks and to European banks in service of this debt. And for every $1 that is received in grant aid, including global health, these same countries pay back $2.30 in debt service. A lot of these countries spend more on debt, at least in the early 2000s, than on healthcare, including some of the ones that are listed there. So with this skyrocketing debt, in 1982, Mexico was the first LMIC to default on its loans. And so they basically told the feds that they're not going to service them anymore. And so a bunch of other LMICs followed, and there was this global debt crisis, worsening recession, and this sort of paved the way for neoliberalism to come into the world stage, which was really championed by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher of Britain. So what is neoliberalism? It is the argument that free markets best distribute society's resources in an optimal way, that governments are inefficient, they overspend, the feds mismanage our money by jacking up the interest rates, et cetera. So it focuses on cutting government spending, including on social welfare programs, the public health sector, including healthcare. And so as Reagan and Thatcher became leaders, they appointed policymakers with these orientations to the World Bank and to the IMF. And as a result, for the next 40 years into today, these neoliberal economic policies have had massive influence on global health funding and programming. And it's really changed this idea of health as something that should be universal and provided for as a responsibility of governments to something that's a commodity and that the market is responsible for providing. All right, so structural adjustment programs. These were economic policies that the IMF and the World Bank implemented once these countries started to default on their loans, that essentially they had to follow these changes in their economies in order to qualify for future loans. And these are really, really important in global health. Essentially, they forced countries, if they were to get loans, to orient their economy towards neoliberalism with decreased government spending, including laying off healthcare workers, cutting government programs in health, encouraging foreign investment, which includes reducing taxation, which provides a base for things like healthcare, and a privatization of economy, including privatizing healthcare. So the structural adjustment program's impact on health, that it cut healthcare spending by 50% in the 42 poorest sub-Saharan African nations in the 80s. Ministries of health, who are sort of like the major public health, health infrastructure, administrative components in a lot of these countries, that's just the name that they use. Their budgets were slashed, which resulted in poorly equipped facilities, inadequate workforce, and difficulty in procuring adequate medicine. And so healthcare systems across Sub-Saharan Africa faced a lot of challenges with this really slashed budget and started to rely much more on donor dependence, aka global health. And this is from an organization who reviewed the structural adjustment programs, like an independent organization. And just to read what they said, they concluded that SAPs have been expanding poverty, inequality, and insecurity around the world. Their effects, particularly on the poor, are so profound and pervasive that no amount of targeted social investments can begin to address the social crises that they have engendered. These are very impactful. So what replaced primary healthcare? With this new cost effectiveness in mind, with limited budget, global policy is something called selective primary healthcare. And I think that word really says a lot. And essentially it has entailed NGOs, charity organizations, aid organizations, and sort of these magic bullet, focus on magic bullet type solutions, rather than healthcare infrastructure. And so it has involved a lot more reliance on global partners. So I wanted to share this clip here. Stop screen sharing.
The president of the World Bank has warned that the spread of Ebola is threatening the future of Africa. Jim Yong Kim made the comments during a meeting in Washington, D.C. Shihab Ratansi reports.
It was a warning that went beyond much of what had already been said.
Ladies and gentlemen, unless we quickly contain and stop the Ebola epidemic, nothing less than the future of not only West Africa, but perhaps even Africa, is at stake.
Those international governments and organizations present were quick to pledge help. Even the IMF said it was ready to forget its usual rules.
It is good to increase the fiscal deficit when it's a matter of curing the people, of taking the precautions to actually try to contain the disease. The IMF doesn't say that very often.
That seemed to come as a surprise to the president of Guinea.
The president of the IMF, managing director, said that we need help and we can increase our deficit, which is quite a change from the usual narrative.
It's a fundamental point. Some say holding the meeting here was bitterly ironic because both the World Bank and the IMF bear responsibility for Ebola's rapid rise. The IMF because its economic orthodoxy prevents governments from spending on healthcare infrastructure. The World Bank because it concentrates on privatized development and not public healthcare facilities. For example, Oxfam studied the World Bank's $1 billion Health in Africa initiative. It wasn't happy with what it found.
Unfortunately, there's some parts of the World Bank, the Finance Corporation, which is the private sector lending arm of the bank, has been investing in private hospitals and clinics that are broadly serving the wealthy in Africa and not reaching the poor. And we want to see less of that type of investment and more investments in strong public health systems that can reach all people, especially the poorest people.
Oxfam says forcing countries to limit spending and privatize healthcare gives them little chance against Ebola. The World Bank's chief economist for Africa, though, says policy has changed. I put Oxfam's findings to him.
I certainly hope we were not financing those.
That's the IFC was, the International Finance Corporation.
The IFC, it may be, then you'd have to ask a colleague from the IFC.
That's the financing corporation of the World Bank, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But at the World Bank, what we try to do is to reduce poverty.
The World Bank has called for a $20 billion global health fund to deal with emergencies like the Ebola outbreak. But even the officials present at this meeting have admitted that if just a fraction of that money had been spent on long-term public health infrastructure, many lives would have been saved. Shihab Ratansi, Al Jazeera, Washington.
All right, so I'm curious, does anyone have any sort of reflections or thoughts about that clip? Initial reactions. See if I can share my screen back. Yeah, so I guess for me, I just think the shock of the president of Guinea being surprised that the IMF was saying, okay, fine, you can spend a little bit of your money on healthcare infrastructure because we have Ebola. But that's sort of the power that these institutions hold with financing, and how a lot of countries are able to spend their money on health. I think that video just highlights just how large that power differential is and how important these institutions are. Let's see. Yeah, so any questions or comments before kind of moving on?
Nick, I wonder, like, these sort of like power institutions are holding over this like smaller government, how that's playing out during COVID. And I guess like these smaller countries often are bearing the brunt or much higher percentages of burden with much lower healthcare infrastructure, and how these like Western or Northern institutions are like holding that over these countries.
Yeah, thanks, Anisha. I wonder that too. I know that in the last couple of years, and I think because of Ebola, the IMF and the World Bank have started to change these policies that they call them austerity measures, these really strict enforcement of these specific economic policies. They've started to loosen up austerity measures after Ebola because of the growing call to do so. But I still think that they're largely in practice, and I'm not sure how much they've loosened up those requirements to get loans. And those would be curious to hear. All right. So yeah, just bringing this back a little bit to this movement to decolonize global health. And I should say too, I have a specific viewpoint and opinion you might be able to tell about the way some of these policies are enacted and how they've affected the world's political economy, but there are certainly other viewpoints. So back to the decolonize movement, what exactly does this mean for global health, and what can we do? I think for anyone involved in global health, it's really just important to understand that any global health issue, the need for a certain project, the need for an NGO may exist because or be perpetuated by the way some of these global policies play out on the world stage, their impact on local government spending and on health infrastructure. Just to know that we are inescapably a part of that context as players in global health, and they're important to consider. I think on the macro level, for people interested and in this field, that means that we also can and should be advocates relating to policy as they perpetuate these power differentials and inequities. And within the field, I think there is growing call, and for good reason, just to have a mindset change that we from high-income countries who are in this field are not the leaders, but should be partners and allies to our colleagues in the low and middle income nations that we're partnering with. There are a lot of specific initiatives that I want to call out, something called iTech that's at UW that focuses on a lot of clinical capacity building and has a lot of offices in different countries around the world with the headquarters in Seattle, but they're shifting the headquarters, they're phasing out the headquarters and sort of leaving these local offices to continue on with the work just as partners. So I think shifting where a lot of the headquarters are of these institutions is a big move. There are a lot of good bidirectional partnerships and exchanges that UW has, including with the University of Nairobi, which includes our Naivasha site. That's a long-standing partnership where a lot of University of Nairobi residents, public health students have come to UW to study, and residents and students also go to Naivasha or to University of Nairobi. And again, going back to some of those things we talked about earlier, working as partners to promote authorship on our papers that we collaborate with on our colleagues abroad. trying to promote local journals, and trying to diversify who is in our global health departments and where these departments are. And I think just on a personal level, for any of us that are involved in global health experiences, just always remembering the questions of sort of what added value do I bring, asking those who benefits questions to make sure that the work that you're involved in is not something that may do more harm than good. So the limitations, I think, of this framework, overall, I think it's a great framework that has led to a lot of discussion and talk within this field. And I think it's a very positive thing. But I think we also have to make sure that we are not the only ones having these conversations, that it's not just the global north talking about decolonizing global health. To include our partners' discussion of what the future of collaboration looks like. I think it's, you know, a nice buzzword. It looks and sounds good to talk about it, but without action, it can be hollow. So there is this great article, if anyone is interested in this topic, from The Lancet. And I just will read a quote here. Will global health survive its decolonization? Perhaps, but only if its practitioners commit to its true transformation. A crucial first step is recognizing that ours is a discipline that holds within itself a deep contradiction. Global health was birthed in supremacy, but its mission is to reduce or eliminate inequities globally. To transcend its origins, global health must become actively anti-supremacist and also anti-oppressionist and anti-racist. Equity and justice involve flipping every axis of supremacy on its head. And then as far as, I thought this was a great paper, so I'm gonna read a second quote. As far as like what they envisioned this actually looking like, they said, it is a different world. Reports of racism in global health organizations are a thing of the past. These organizations are no longer white-led, white-dominated institutions in high-income countries, but have been reoriented. But have reoriented their operations to be closer and accountable to the people they serve. They are run by people who are local to the issues, and local knowledge takes preeminence. Governed inclusively and responsibly, these organizations now focus on organic change as allies and enablers of local processes and learning. Rather than seeing global health as charity or saviorism, they seek to push for health as a fundamental human right locally and globally. All right, so that is it. Done a little early, but why don't we just blabber on for a while? So why don't we open it up and just see if anyone has any final questions or comments, points of discussion.
Nick, I just wanted to clarify, sorry, this is like a Michael Barbaro moment where I'm like, so what you're telling me is that there are restrictions on the loans that global South countries can get from the World Bank, that you cannot get a loan for a like publicly funded, government funded health project. And that is because of Reaganism in the 80s.
Yeah, yes. So yeah, structural adjustment programs, which came out of the 80s, birth sort of championed by Reagan and Thatcher, but which have continued as the major economic thinking of these institutions, and therefore like continued these structural adjustment programs do dictate that you have to have your economies oriented this way or you will not get the loan. And so in that clip is what we saw was the IMF. The president of Guinea was shocked that they were saying that you could use some of this money and increase your deficit, use some of the loan money on health infrastructure, because that is not a thing that they're very strict, and the IMF works in a lot of these countries, has offices in these countries in order to ensure that that is how the money is used, or rather not used. And it's because there's a lot of people, that economists, that really feel like those austerity measures are fundamental to growth of an economy early on, to be able to get a tax base. It's not, I don't necessarily think it's because people have ulterior motives. I think you can question that. Certainly opening up markets abroad benefits certain, CocaCola can go, because there's open markets, CocaCola can go and make more money in wherever we are working globally. But they absolutely do regulate how they use the money if they're to receive these grants.
Got it. Out of and the ultimate motivation being, if you have a healthy, good economy, then better health and health infrastructure follows, rather than. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. That's the idea behind it. Is they call them austerity measures because it's very like firm, and I think a lot of people that believe in them do believe that they eventually lead to a growing economy that has its own tax base that can be independent. But I think that we've seen over 40 years that that's not necessarily what's happened, and that it started off unfairly, an unfair keel with this massive debt burden that these countries were sort of, they had to take out loans, but the countries that gave the loans skyrocketed the interest rates, and it was just an unfair game. So I think there's also a lot of talk about eliminating like the debt, like taking away the debt for some of these countries. So Tom's, I grew up, is it okay if I read this, Tom? I grew up in Kenya and recall how the World Bank and IMF have so much respect. Okay, thanks. They're painted as our savior, go-to organizations that focus on poverty eradication. The more I look into them and hear what they're about, the more I've realized that they're actually part of the problem, a big part. Yeah, thanks for that. Appreciate that insight from someone who grew up in Kenya.
Hey Nick, this is Terrence. Thanks for the talk. Really enjoyed it. I was wondering if you could comment on kind of piggybacking off of Anisha's comment about COVID and kind of the current discussions about like vaccine equity and how like certain programs, I think like COVAX, are trying to, increase the equity, but with like Omicron, I was wondering kind of what some of those current discussions are, and if you could just, if you happen to know, kind of give us an update on what the current talk is about that.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I have limited, I'm not sure where exactly some of the talk is as far as the vaccine equity, other than knowing that a lot of people in global health, including in the United States, are very much talking about it. There's been some movements. A group of physicians at Harvard sort of like did this walkout type thing where they refused their boosters in order to sort of raise awareness and saying, hey, look how many, like we're getting our booster, but the rest of the world doesn't have their first or second dose yet. So I'm really appreciative, I guess, of some of the at least public awareness efforts that have been pushed, but I still feel like personally it's just a massive, massive problem that hasn't been given the attention. And unfortunately, it's most likely because it doesn't, the folks who hold the vaccines don't financially benefit, and just a really tough problem. So yeah, I don't have great insight into though what COVAX. I guess John says COVAX remains undersupported despite words from many governments. Anyone else have any insight into that?
This is a little separate from the economic comments that you had and the economic discussions, but there is also a lot of discussion about the role of government funding that we have in the West, particularly when we're talking about NIH support for companies such as Moderna, right? NIH partnerships allowed Moderna to really ramp up its mRNA vaccinations, and you may have seen in the news that there's a lot of attention paid. Moderna is pushing back and saying that the patents are theirs rather than despite the support from the NIH. And so there's a lot of, I don't know how to say this neutrally, so I won't, a lot of shenanigans in terms of what's going on, because clearly there's big money involved as well.
Thanks, John. Okay, let's see, what time is it? 11:25. Okay. Anyone else have any other final thoughts or comments? Questions?
Nick, what are the global health folks at UW doing to diversify the faculty and trainees who are involved in global health here? Because what's really jumping out in this quote that you have up is these organizations are no longer white-led, white-dominated institutions in high-income countries. And I think that's a real consideration at our institution specifically.
Yeah, thank you, Anisha, for that. Yeah, so I'm appreciative that the department, we have a course in our residency program that is called like Global Health for the Clinician or Global Health Leadership or something along those lines. And I will say that there are a few other folks in that class too that may even be on this call. I think almost every presenter that we had talked about decolonizing. It's pretty much being talked about in the department. And as far as actual action items, rather than just having the discussions, I will say that from my perspective, I happened to do some research work with Dr. Carrie Farquhar, who is one of the ID docs who does a lot in Kenya. And on some of the individual calls that we've had with our Kenyan colleagues there, we bring up this topic and just talk about it together and what exactly people think about it. So I think within individual spheres, I think it's sort of filtered down to those discussions and trying to hear out what people think about this and try to figure out the way together forward. Other action items from the department or from UW. I think I don't know of other major initiatives that are coming out of it. I would imagine that there's some, I guess ITech that I mentioned is a part of the department, which is trying to spread out and give its ownership to other countries, which I think is a great step. But yeah, I don't know other specific actions. I would guess that there are some, but I also don't want to say without knowing. It's a great question though.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. I think there's a lot of comments in the chat about how much everyone appreciated this and learned from your talk. So thanks so much for being here and sharing this with us. If there's any other lingering questions, I'm sure we can stick around for another minute or two. But otherwise, y'all can kind of move on to your mornings. It was good to see everyone. I hope you have a good rest of the day.